What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Strength Classroom. I can't remember what episode this is, but I told you I'm going to be having some people on that you may have heard of, have some people on that you may not have heard of, and I feel like they need more exposure. This one's probably going to be an example of someone you've heard of, a man that needs no introduction, world-renowned powerlifter, Matt Wenning. We're going to be talking about a bunch of conjugate stuff and from one of the greatest sources that I can think of. So how are you today, Matt?
Good. Just busy. Did some assessments for some people out of town today. So it was pretty swamped with that from about 8 o'clock till about 3:30.
Good. So what I normally do with my just guests that I have on is just a general, maybe 1 to 2 minute introduction. Why should we know you? Maybe in your case, you could say your best lifts at any weight class, some people you've trained, where you've trained, just a brief introduction for those of you that may not know.
Yeah. So I started lifting in 1992, won my first world championships at 19 years old in 1999, won my first collegiate national championship in 2003. Broke my first all-time world record in 2008, did another world record in 11. In between that time, I was working with the Army Special Forces, Airborne Divisions, and Border Patrol, also holding contracts with the local fire departments at different townships. And then that transitioned into actually servicing and helping diesel mechanics lower their injury rates while working on automobiles and trucks and semis. And then I've ran my own facility since 2010 in the area.
Okay, cool. So what I've had other guests talk about the conjugate, and I've answered this question myself, but your knowledge is definitely higher than mine in this regard. It goes way deeper. What would you say the biggest misconception about conjugate training in general when it comes to any population? For me, off the top of my head, I could say people think Westside, Barbell, and conjugate are necessarily the same thing. I learned pretty early that they're clearly not the same thing. But what would you say from your experience is the biggest misconception, just conjugate training in general?
Well, the misconception is that conjugate training is only used for powerlifting. But if you look at a lot of the detailed books from overseas, you see Bondarchuk use it for throwing, shot put, discus, and hammer, where he developed 100 different exercises for throwers based on A.S. Mevdiev's thought process on conjugate training. It was initially designed and developed for Olympic lifting, so it has transitioned over into the Olympic lifting era. I think the only reason we see a lot of misconceptions is because in the West, Louie was one of the first people to use a conjugate system to the uneducated person. But if you go back even farther than Louie, about 40 years prior, you had a guy named Paul Anderson, and Paul Anderson rotated exercises on a near weekly basis as well. And he was considered by most at the time to be one of the top strength athletes that the U.S. had ever produced, and the only Olympic lifter at the super heavyweight division to win a gold medal. So you learn pretty quickly, if you're trying to have a long, lengthy, and injury-reduced career, that variety is going to be a key source of your thought process in your training.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I feel like you were the first person that I ever heard use the term overuse injury, and I never really came across that myself. I feel like when you're less experienced in the beginning, you can get away with things longer. It just depends on the amount of forces you're putting on your body and the amount of weight you're lifting in general. But I've said that, like, if you're doing, people say my elbows are hurting from doing tricep stuff, but they do nothing but the same tricep exercise. That's kind of, you just answered your own question right there. You're putting the same forces on the same joint over and over again. So you don't have to necessarily, would you agree that you don't necessarily have to switch every workout, but there needs to be some form of variety just to give your body a break from the same movement patterns?
I think if we look at someone that I revere at high regard, a guy like Tudor Bompa, that utilizes what they called a step method, and or Verkhoshansky that utilized a block method, which I was fortunate enough to have pretty detailed conversations with him before he passed away. They believe, and I believe somewhat, which you can see in my apps on Train Heroic and Patreon, that we follow 3-week waves. So where we will introduce, stimulate, and then annihilate, and then change the exercises. So I find 21-day cycles are usually optimal for most people for getting, 1, comfortable with the exercise, 2, pushing the limits of that and developing a motor pattern for it, and then being able to really test your abilities in that movement pattern without getting away from other things too long. So I find that 21-day waves with some sort of a deload. If you read a lot of the top level books, talk about that pretty consistently. And I found that basically by default from training at a world-class level for 25 years, that I could go really hard for 3 weeks. And if I didn't back down the fourth week, I could get away with it for 1 or 2 mesocycles. But after that, I was in such a rut that it nearly took a month to pull away and get out of that rut. What I found is that the teachings of Medvedev, Verkhoshansky, and Bondarchuk, they all came to the same conclusion when training high-level athletes for long enough. I think the problem that we have now in the sporting industry is we see these super strong people show up out of the woodwork. They're really good for only a handful of years, and then they're just gone and disappeared. If you look at it from an investment standpoint, the Soviet Union wanted to stay as far away from that as possible, because once they got someone up to what they considered master of sport, they wanted them to last at that level as long as possible in order to recoup their investment, right? And so that's where you see the Soviet Union start to split away from the Bulgarian system, where they were more cutthroat and had, say, 100 or more people in each weight class. They just selected the Bo Jacksons out of each weight class and then took them and broke them and then built new ones 4 years later. Whereas the Soviets were a little bit more mindful of what they were trying to do. And so that's when you start to see the real change around the mid 70s to the mid 80s. And selfishly for me, I wish that the Soviet Union would have held together another 10 or 15 years, because I feel like their understanding of how training adapted to the body was only starting to scratch the surface by the mid late 80s. And then everything was financially falling apart. So the next closest people to that level would have been the East Germans. They had the same fate when the communistic systems fell apart, but the East Germans had more money per capita for each athlete. So they were developing very interesting things in the late 70s and 80s because they had the access to the Soviet Union's training protocols with, in some regards, better genetics and better coaches per se.
That's an interesting, yeah, because when the Bulgarian system is essentially, I've never run it or I don't know much about it. It's kind of like just the same thing over and over again until you either adapt or break, essentially, right?
Yeah, they basically tried to find the Terminators in their particular gene pool. They weren't looking for development, not that they didn't have developmental characteristics, but the Bulgarian system was the crude initial system of the Russians. And then the Russians figured out their mistakes and realized if they wanted a science-based training understanding, that they needed to have hundreds of masters of sport and not just a dozen. And so they started to have more research, more development, more science behind what they were doing and pushing the envelope, where the Bulgarians realized that the initial Soviet system was really, really good, and they realized it had faults, but they also realized they could just go grab another person when they got broke. And you see this in a lot of the old school Olympic weightlifting books. I think his name's Dolschler. He writes a lot about the differences between the Russian and Bulgarian systems, and the Russians basically surpassing the Bulgarians in thought process and science around 1975.
Yeah, I've noticed just based on listening to you speak, you've read a lot of stuff based on other systems and like the Eastern Bloc methods. That's something I'm not really super familiar with. So it's always interesting when I watch a video of yours. I feel like that's where I learn a lot
stuff
from.
like that is very difficult to find. It's not something you can just go look up on the internet, which is what I really like about that system, because the Russians never wrote books to appease to the average population. They wrote manuals and training modalities for other high-skilled and highly educated coaches. So if you pick up a Verkhoshansky book or a Medvedev book or a Roman book or some of these other authors and pioneers of strength sports, you have to have a very good base knowledge to pull away from those books, educational stuff that you can actually use, because for most people, their baseline educational knowledge isn't high enough, both in biomechanics and exercise physiology, to really understand what they're talking about. And they were very mathematically driven as well. And to be completely fair with you, I open up those books probably, I dig into that stuff again and reoccurring about every 3 to 4 weeks. And every time I pick up one of those books, I pick up something else. And those books I've had for over 25 years, maybe almost 30 now. And so what I find is that the knowledge that's left in those textbooks is more of you understand paragraph 1, you apply paragraph 1, you start to understand paragraph or chapter 2. It's not one of those things you can read and be like, oh, I'm a conjugate expert. It's like you have to live that for decades in order for you to really understand and grasp what they're talking about. And that's what I liked about that information and what drove me to write the book that I have coming out with Human Kinetics at some point in time when the editing is done.
Cool, cool. We talked about misconceptions earlier. I feel like one of the biggest misconceptions, just due to the fact that it is a bulk of the conjugate training, is how people implement max effort and dynamic effort method. I feel like most people just do the standard work up to heavy single and do like 9 sets of 3 for bench, let's say. Are there any methods you've tinkered with to where it still falls in the realm of max effort and dynamic effort? It's going to both build those qualities, but it's not necessarily the like traditional in the Westside book of methods type of stuff like that?
Yeah. And again, I'm not hating on the Westside book of methods or any of the literature that Louie put out, but I used about 2 references out of 1,200 for my conjugate book from Westside Barbell. And the reason is because they just weren't tight enough of educational drive to be able to use them. Not that they're wrong or right, but what you find is that if you bring an athlete in that needs more hypertrophy, what's the problem with doing max effort work at 6 and 8 RM? There's not. Whereas you wouldn't want to necessarily do 1 and 2 and 3 RMs with a person that's strong but needs more muscle mass in order to develop whatever they're trying to develop. The dynamic effort method is one of those areas as well that gets confused, where if you're in a hypertrophy block, for example, you might want to utilize eccentric tempos in order to increase time under tension, although you're not manipulating the concentric tempo. So you're still moving on a concentric basis as fast as possible, but you might be able to manipulate the eccentrics with either ratchet style movements of isometric stopping points or 3 or 5 second eccentrics. That could be something that you don't see a lot of, but you hear guys like Vorbiev from the old Soviet system talking about mixing and matching contractile properties in order to enhance strength. But what you have to realize is that the conjugate system is usually designed from where your shortcomings lie. So if someone, say, really sucks at a really deep box squat, say a 12-inch box, so I'm 6'1", so a 12-inch box for me requires me to have to lean over fairly far to touch a 12-inch box. It's not that I'm not good at it, it's just hard. But the point being is if I know that that'll raise my squat up 10%, but it's uncomfortable, you'll see a lot of people pick an exercise that they feel physically or mentally comfortable with versus the ones that actually create the progress. The conjugate system is difficult under low-level education and also low-level talks with yourself on what's going to work and what you like to do, because a lot of times those things are very different environments. There's a lot of things that we put into training that are not my favorite exercises to do, but they make me better. And so that was a constant measurement tool for the old Soviet system and what we do at Winning Strength. And Louie did the same thing. You know, he would pick exercises that he knew guys would struggle with, would put percentages of weights on them when they max with traditional loads. The real reason I think that you see a lot of conjugate system get confused is that Louie never really dealt with at Westside Barbell what I would consider novice lifters. Most people that set out to go to Westside Barbell were already pretty good in their own right. I'll give you an example. Myself, I was already a collegiate national champion, and I was already ranked top 20 in the world before I even touched Westside Barbell. So was Greg Panora. So was Vlad Hasselhoff, the Israeli guy that still has the all-time world record in the squat with just knee wraps. You have a lot of dudes that showed up that were already formidable with technique with traditional loads. And then once that bands and chains got introduced, there was a whole nother environment to adapt to. And I think people may, and sometimes do, utilize methods that are maybe too advanced for them at that time. So I'm not saying that bands and chains don't work at each level, but the amount in which they work is drastically changed by what advancement portion you are in your training. If you're already a 900-pound squatter, bands and chains are going to create a 1,000-pound squatter. But if you're squatting 185 pounds or 100 kilos, the same percentage of jump is not going to be nearly as impressive, right? So 900 to 1,000 is 10%. So if I squat 185, that means my squat goes up 18 pounds. So I'm going to squat 204. So when and where you introduce those things is crucial to the training apparatus as far as the mesocycle and the yearly plan.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. Someone actually just, I uploaded one of my workouts and someone was like, I want to do this workout. How much band tension should I need for myself if I'm a beginner? And I asked how much they bench. And he said, I typically do sets of 135 for 5. And I said, band tension is the least of your worries at this point. Like you're a
Yeah.
beginner. He was 17. I was like, you pretend bands don't exist because they're not going to do much
Yeah.
for you at
The
that
only,
point.
the only, the only shortcut to that is having a very high skilled coach that can adjust and adapt. So I have a lady named Sarah that works out at my gym and works out at my gym and has never touched barbells per se up to about 2.5, 3 years ago when I first started training her. And I did start her off with some bands and some chains, but the adjustment necessary for a complete rookie, it makes the process a lot longer because you're not specifying the bench press, the squat, or the deadlift right off the rip. But what I have found is that it's increased her want to train hard. She has gained probably in maximal strength slower than if I would have specifically attacked that particular goal. But her technique and her understanding of how her body functions is far exceeding what she was able to do with straight weights. And again, she's not looking to compete. So if you have a highly skilled coach like myself or Dave Tate, or if Louie Simmons was still alive, or Charles Poliquin, or if you had guys like, Joe DeFranco or Michael Boyle, if you had guys like that in your corner, you may be able to use advanced training systems a little bit faster because that coach would know when enough's enough. But for the average person, I mean, I'm still opening books and learning, and I'm 46, and I have been a studying meathead for 30 years and I'm still learning new things. Again, like every time I open up those books, it's like, oh man, I missed that point. Or yeah, I already knew that because I've been doing it. Or it could be all sorts of different factors. But the point being is that I think what's agitating for some people, but very driving for others is the fact that you will constantly keep learning how the physical body adapts to training because it's so individual. Some people can utilize a conjugate system right off the rip and get really stronger and get a lot of muscle mass and reduce injuries and reduce overuse issues. And some people get really strong doing the bare basics. Bulgarians style training, for example. You see a lot of the newer lifters, they don't really touch. The guys at the top are not really touching a lot of band tension and chains, and you don't see them doing a lot of that. And they're getting impressive results. But I also find that their careers are shorter. And so with me, for example, I drove into wanting to learn how to train the smartest I could because one, out of the gate, I was never the strongest guy in the world. I had some gifts, but I had to work really, really hard to obtain a world-class status. We're talking like I didn't break my first world record until year 14 of training. So 14 years of grinding got me my first world record, maybe 15. And so I always had to just outlast everyone and outsmart people in order for me to get better, which I think made me a very exceptional coach because I think sometimes when you're genetically gifted and everything makes you strong, you don't necessarily learn why you're getting stronger. When you hit massive roadblocks in training and you have to outsmart yourself around those, you learn very, very quickly that there are limitations that you can push other people past once you see them start to arise because you've worked through those milestones and those brick walls. I can remember right off the top of my head, I remember benching my first 500. And that's when I started to realize how important tricep strength was for the bench press. Sounds crazy that you get to a 500-pound bench press and now you're learning that triceps are the main factor. And I was already at 20 years old having shoulder issues. Not that they were hurt. They were just tired and sore and fatigued all the time because I was training with a straight bar and straight weight all the time. And how do you get stronger? You do more reps with the same damn exercise, right? Louie kind of put the hatchet down on that and had me switching exercises, focusing on triceps. And a year later, my bench goes to 530. And then a year later after that, 565. And then a year later after that, 600. So the point being is that what if I would have stayed with that same system I was using? I probably would have had to back down or retire because one or both of my shoulders would have been trashed. But now at nearly 46, my joints are fine. I feel great skeletal wise. And I think a lot of that was from the rotation. So For me, you kind of have to decide, are you long haul? Are you in it for the long haul? Or are you trying to get better right now? And the problem is most people that have a bug to be strong, they also have the bug to have no patience. You know, they just don't have the patience to want to get
Yeah.
better. And that patience is education. You know, it doesn't, you open up if you've ever seen them, you open up a Verkhoshansky book or a Medvedev book and you try to read that front to back, buckle in for like 2 weeks because it's not easy reading. And there's a lot of information in there that you can't just skim over. That's what I find we have such a huge problem with in the United States is everybody thinks that getting stronger is as simple as more intensity, longer workouts, more volume, right? They don't really understand that the technique and the deloading and the optimization of loading are probably more crucial than all the ones listed beforehand.
Well, I think a thing that people also don't take into account that just like shooting a basketball and swinging a baseball bat and doing anything that is involved in other sports, lifting maximal efforts, maximal weights is in fact a skill in itself. You're not just magically going to be doing 80% of work for sets of 5, whatever, and then all of a sudden, boom, hit a 100-pound PR the next time you max out. Like if you're putting weights on your back that you've never put before, that's a shock to your system. I remember when I was quite young, I figured when I was going into my first powerlifting competition, I figured if I just, when I'm peaking, then put a heavier than normal weight on my back and then walk it out, when I do in fact attempt that way, it's not going to be as scary. And I think people don't really realize, like I said, like it's a skill. They just figure one day, oh, I'm just going to put more weight and I've been training hard, so I should be able to hit this weight.
Yeah.
But it doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah.
When it comes to, you said patience. When it comes to, let's say you have like 5 exercises in a rotation of max effort or whatever amount of exercises. When you next come back to that variation, when you're looking to break a PR, let's say on like an indicator exercise, what do you aim to break it by? Because I know myself, whenever I used to come back, it was like I'd be taking like a 50-pound jump. I'd be like, oh no, I'm ready for this. And now I feel like I'm a little bit more modest. I feel like if I break it by 5 pounds, I know the plan is working. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of usually not introducing a similar exercise for at least 12 to 15 weeks.
Okay.
I feel that depending on the level of the athlete that you're training will depend on how much specificity is needed in between. So I find in peaking phases, most amateurs or intermediate lifters need to touch regular free weights under a competition standard within reason about every 3 to 4 weeks, or they lose touch. So again, if you do a safety bar squat for 5 or 6 weeks with a beginner, their straight bar squat, when you go back to it, it's not going to look good. It's going to look disoriented, I suppose would be the best term. But I find that with advanced people, they can get away with not touching something semi-specific for up to 8 to 10 weeks. And so I find that your selection of exercises should be coming from your harsh breakdown of key exercises that you see technical breakdown. So if you see upper back rounding or knees caving in or chest falling over or foot pressure being incorrect, you select an exercise that enhances that ability for a period of time, and then you push it back into the compound movement with hopefully a fix or a remedy from what you've seen from the previous lifts. So it's not as simple as just rotation. There is more to it. You have to think about what you're trying to activate, what you're trying to potentiate, and what you're trying to tell the body to rewire. And once you get that wiring system situated, you need to plug it back in to the compound movement in which you're trying to fix technical capacity. And maybe that technical capacity is a strain, like what you're saying. Like people get under certain heavy weights, if they're not straining on a consistent basis, just the strain is unfamiliar. And so talking about sports, for example, large varieties of exercises are crucial because with a baseball player, for example, we're not trying to make them a world-class squatter. We're trying to make squatting make them better at baseball. So if you're specifically squatting with a straight bar and straight weight all the time in the exact same foot position, how much transfer is that really to the field? My opinion would be marginal. I would rather take an athlete that is really good at 15 different styles of squats. Not the best, but really good at 15 different styles, like a box squat, a safety bar squat, chain squats, high bar squats, front squats, pause squats, narrow stance, wide stance. We could keep going and going. If someone's pretty proficient, no matter where I put their feet or where I put a bar or how I change it, that's probably a really good athlete that is well-rounded. But if a person goes, well, I only back squat on a low bar with my feet here because that's where I feel the strongest, now you're specifying their strength, which is starting to reduce the transfer over to sport.
Yeah, and I've always said specifically for athletes that are in the field, like baseball, football, like those traditional team sports, you do want them to be good at different variations with different grips, different foot placements, because you don't know how their body is. Sports are unpredictable. They don't know how their body's going to be moving, so they have to be strong in different joint angles and all those things. Like I understand the traditional lifts or the traditional lifts, and some athletes might just be freaks that's all they need. But a better, like you said, it's a more well-rounded approach that takes care of a bunch of different things, let's say, like just joint angles to be specific.
I think from what I've seen working with a lot of these pro teams is that what sports teams really want is they want the genetic freak that doesn't have to be highly educated trained. They want the person to show up, they put minimal effort into them, and they're just good. You find that quite extensively in pro sports where a lot of those guys that are in that level are just born with it. And you can tell the reasoning on that is how much does, say, a pro strength coach make in Major League Baseball, right? They don't make 100th of what their top player makes. So are they really putting them at the high level of their importance? In my opinion, no. I think strength conditioning is probably one of the most underpaid and under-respected professions in sports because our systems are set up to find the freaks. They're not set up to make people better. Now, you do end up having people like a Michael Jordan or a Kobe Bryant that will work extra on their own to show up with new and better skills, whether it be strength or speed or whatever. But you notice that a lot of these top players in all these different sports have their own private coaches, but they don't necessarily get that type of attention at the team, right? And that's where you start realizing like, well, maybe this is, they're just looking for genetics. And then it's kind of up to the individual player. I'll give you an example. When I was out at the San Diego Padres in November, they have one of their top players loves this machine that's in their training camp that is a total piece of trash, but he likes it. So it stays there. He doesn't understand anything about training. And he is their most physically gifted, most physically apt trainer. And he will not listen to the strength coaches to get rid of it and get something better. And that's when you start realizing, like, some people just have it and some people just don't. And so not to take away work ethic from people, but you're not going to make it to the NBA by just working hard. You're not going to make it to the NFL by just working hard. You're going to have some intangibles that are just God-given, right? I think powerlifting is becoming that because of its social media grab. You get guys like Colton, the South African guy, that's deadlifting like 1,050 double overhand sumo. Like, dude, I remember when Andy Bolton pulled the first 1,003 and nobody thought that was ever going to get touched again. And there's a lot of different reasonings behind that. But my point being is like, you start seeing a lot of these different numbers evolve because the population grab is so much bigger. It's finding more freaks.
Yeah. I feel like it's very common across all sports.
Yeah, exactly. And so your biggest freaks are going to be where the biggest money's at. NBA, NFL, NHL, overseas soccer, those are the top athletes in the world because they make the top money, And so again, I'm not cracking on powerlifting or Olympic lifting, but you take, you take an 11-year-old person that's supposed to probably, let's say we could future guess that they're going to be an NFL running back and you teach them how to do Olympic lifting. Good luck to the Olympic lifting records. Because what would you rather have, a gold medal or $500 million? I'd rather have $500 million. You know what I mean?
Have you ever, I'm not sure if this would be in your wheelhouse. Have you ever heard of the show? It's on Netflix. It's called Physical 100.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it, but I've heard of it.
So, okay, it's pretty interesting show because they take people from all different like populations and make them do random strength or endurance or whatever challenges. And there was this guy, I had him pegged from the beginning. I was like, this guy, he's smaller than the rest, but he's got to be up there. He was a gold medal wrestler. This guy's just, his strength and endurance and just everything was just out of this world. Like, I don't even think the average person could imagine just how much better an Olympic athlete is at almost any physical realm than what they think. Like, they think
Well,
whatever they think they're better than the average person, I would say multiply it by 10.
and you're picking another sport too that is not only full body, but a mixture of explosiveness and endurance. You know, you look at an Olympic level wrestler, that's why so many of them succeeded in UFC. That's why so many of
Yeah.
them have succeeded in CrossFit. I'm sure CrossFit's taken a couple of Olympic level wrestlers that's done really well. They're just so rounded. I mean, you don't find people that can wrestle that long, 3-4 hour practices and still be insanely strong doing that. You know, one of the only other people I've ever ran into that had that similar drive was a guy that used to come to Westside that was a gold medalist in judo. And I remember him just sparring around with guys in the gym, and you couldn't even get him to break a sweat. And he's wrestling around with 1,000-pound squatters and just ragdolling them. Yeah, and it was interesting to see because people think that those types of, they understand your effort and use it against you, you know? And so their kinematic awareness is so much higher than the average person, which makes them look more athletic. Not that they're not athletic, but they look more athletic, even more so because their body control is so superior to the average person. So no energy is wasted in their movements.
Yeah, that's one thing. They really understand the body. They understand how to imbalance the body. They understand how to be efficient with their own body. But
Yeah.
in terms of all sorts of combat sports, I feel like the one that really leans into strength and conditioning the most is, in fact, wrestlers. I just took up jujitsu as a hobby, and I find like half these guys think it's a detriment to get stronger or whatever. They just want to get up their cardio, make sure they're flexible, which are not bad things. But it's like there's this saying in jujitsu that like to not be strong, but it just makes no sense to me because there's no sport where you wouldn't take the athlete, get them stronger,
Well,
and they would be better.
and I'm guesstimating on this, but my thought process on what you're saying and what I've seen with jujitsu is that jujitsu was initially designed, if I had to take a guess, is initially designed for a weaker opponent to overpower a stronger opponent by utilizing
Exactly. Yeah.
technical proficiency and putting them in positions that their strength didn't matter. Here's the problem.
Yeah.
You get two people of equal skill in jujitsu, and one guy is 40% stronger. The 40% stronger guy is going to mop the floor with that dude because all things being equal, strength is the number one determiner of which one's going to be the better, you know. So what I think is we find out, you know, a weaker coach is going to rely on technique and a stronger coach is going to rely on strength moves. It's all about, and again, it's conjugate mindset is we don't focus on strengths, we focus on weaknesses. So take two Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts and one of them benches 495, like my good friend Midwest Kong, who's bench pressed 225, 84 reps, okay? He's a black belt in jiu-jitsu. What is he going to do when he gets a hold of you and puts you in an arm bar? Good luck.
Agreed.
And
Yeah.
so
Even if
is
the strength levels, go ahead.
yeah, my point being is like when everything equal, strength will win. And that's where weak-minded people and people with low work ethics and things they don't like to train. You find a lot of people that go into jiu-jitsu, they don't necessarily like lifting weights. They like to do something that they feel is technically superior. They're not brute strength people. I'm not saying all the time, but from my experience, most of the time. And what you find is that go wrestle somebody like Mark Kerr. I don't know if you remember him, but Mark Kerr was a Division 1A national champion wrestler. It was probably, from what I remember, I'm trying to remember his name now. You remember Kevin Randleman back in the day? Kevin Randleman was a black UFC fighter.
Yep, I remember him.
That won a bunch of stuff. And he was one of the strongest guys I'd ever seen come into the gym at Louie's place. And he said that Mark Kerr, they called him the smashing machine. There's supposed to be a movie coming out about him. He said his technical skill and his strength was so superior that he could damn near never be beaten. The only thing that beat him was his own addictions to other chemicals. But the point being is, with everything aside, you know, strength wins when everything else is equal. And we've lost contact with that with a lot of different sports. You know, football, strength conditioning has become a babysitting episode. We don't work on getting guys stronger. You look back in the 80s and the 90s, the dudes were way more jacked on the offensive and defensive line than they are now. And that's not by coincidence, right? They just had a stronger work ethic for overall general athleticism. And now there's so football specific skill that what we see is that the injury rates are worse in some instances. We see that the guys look sloppier, even though they're quicker, and they just don't have you see all these stupid injuries that could be completely prevented if they had a good strength program. And that's what's sad is like, again, like are you from the United States, right? Okay. So who won the Super Bowl last year? The Eagles, right? Who's the head strength coach for the Eagles? Do you know?
Saquon Barkley?
No, the head strength coach. Who's the guy that does their weight training at the Eagles?
I'm not sure of his name, no.
Yeah. You know why? That's why. You see what I'm saying? So the people that have those jobs they're not the best strength coach in the world. They're there because they worked up the ranks and some offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator was a friend of a friend and they're working with those guys. I look up who the NFL strength coaches are and I have sometimes no idea. I've never even heard of them. And I've been in the field at a top level for 25 years. So tell me what they're doing in the strength room. The answer is we don't know. And sometimes the answer is far less than what you think they're doing. And so my point being is that we've gotten to where we breed strength. We don't produce it. We don't make it. We try to find people that are already genetically gifted and just polish them versus create a diamond out of coal.
Yeah, no, that's well said at the end. When it comes to your last 10, 15 years, what aspect of your training, whether it's in your own training or the way you approach training clients, how would you say that's changed the most? Just one specific aspect.
Work capacity evolving and developing the strength training process. So the Wenning Warmups have been a huge portion of what I have in insurance premium data from the fire departments and the military. And a lot of it is because it's focusing on structural weak points. Like it's not just selecting exercises to do, it's like with purpose. And so I find that developing general physical preparedness and work capacity and putting it in the right place in the workouts has helped tremendously with reducing injuries and enhancing technique. And I just kind of fell on it by accident, really. I was competing. I had hit the third highest total of all time in my weight class. I'm driving home, trying to figure out what went right and what went wrong. And I started to realize that my work capacity was reducing. And I entered into doing more pre-volume for the lift. My work capacity increased and then my maximal strength rose with it. So I guess what I was trying to figure out is if I know that a power lifter needs work capacity, then and we don't really necessarily put those two together. We think, oh, he's a powerlifter, he's not conditioned. Then why do people that are wanting to be high conditioned not think that strength is helpful for that? Because in reality, let's say I just want to be bigger, right? I want to put on more muscle mass. Is the person that can do 315 on the bench for sets of 20 have more potential to build muscle mass than the person that can only do that with 135?
No, it'd obviously be the one that could do 315.
So how much would you have to bench to do 315 for 20 for one?
A hell of a lot more than 315.
Probably 500.
Yeah.
Okay. So why isn't everybody's goal, if they want to increase their conditioning, to increase maximal strength so that their relative amount of percentage of maximal strength they need to use for something lighter gets easier?
Yeah. In theory, yeah, makes solid sense.
Right. So that's why the balance of the repetition method, the dynamic effort method, and the maximal effort method are crucial, because usually one of those three is your weakness, therefore should be taking some or a larger portion of your energy requirements from your training. So just because you like to do reps doesn't necessarily mean max effort work's not for you. Just because you like to do max effort work doesn't mean that high repetition volume is not for you. There are all of these factors that a wise coach or a wise lifter will put into play, and he won't base it off of what he likes to do. He'll base it off of what creates the result.
Is that kind of how you came up with your warm-up method? Is that what kind of inspired it when you discovered that?
The warm-up method came after, so in 2012, I go to a bench-only contest, which was one of the very few bench-only meets I did because I wanted to be on the 600-pound raw bench press record books. And I think the time I did it, I was only the 16th or the 15th guy to do it. I had switched over from equipped lifting to raw lifting. And so then I went completely overboard into completely raw lifting. And I noticed that my squat, although the squat I did was the second or the third highest squat of all time in my weight class, that 600-pound bench wasn't there after that squat. I was tanked. I was tired. And that's what started to make me realize that I needed my conditioning higher to show my strength. And that's what started the ball rolling, not understanding the injury prevention and ligaments and tendons needing high volume, moderate to low intensities, which is in a lot of the Russian books that you read, technical proficiency for picking the right exercises to do. So your technique is also improving when you do your maximal effort lifts. But the problem is with the Wenning warm-up is that most lifters' ego can't drop the weight down far enough to where it's actually usable, and they don't think that conditioning helps maximal strength. And so you see a lot of people overuse too much weight for it, then it detriments the main lift. They don't know what optimal is. And it took me 6 or 8 months of playing with it to figure out what optimal was. So I can understand people's frustration, but again, it's like I tell you, like opening up those Russian manuals. If you think you're going to read that and be enlightened, by the time you get to the last page, you're probably going to be more confused because the stuff in there is not really an easy handout. It's difficult to understand. And so I find that the questions that the average people ask about working out are so elementary that they don't understand the big picture. Not that I understand everything either. There's too many factors involved with endocrinology, biomechanics, neurological systems, circulatory systems, hormonal stuff. Is that really each of those areas is its own lifetime profession. So to understand everything is very difficult, but the people that are constantly searching for knowledge and understanding those things tend to have a better concept of what is more correct.
It's funny what you say about the ego and dropping the weight. I know when I first implemented them, by the second set of dumbbell presses, I was like, oh, I've gone way too heavy.
Well, let's go to
There's
that question.
just no way.
So when I first find out Wenning warmups, I'm benching 600, right? What do you think the dumbbells I were using for warm-up was for 4 sets of 25? I'm 600-pound bencher.
All the same weight? 50s?
30s.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
So what's your best bench?
335.
And what weight were you using for those warm-ups?
Like 50s. So by the first set, I was able to do a set of 25. The second set was already like 15. And I was like, oh, I've gone way too heavy on these.
Yeah, because your mindset is that you want enough to actually do something. It's like, well, if I use at your strength level, you probably should have used 20s, but in your mind,
And that's
like,
what
why
I
would
would
you
use
20s?
now.
That's the girls' rack. I don't use 20s. Like, what's 20s going to do?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and that's everybody's mindset. But my point being is that that is the mindset for most lifters. They don't understand how light and how, how it should be activating, but not detrimenting your training after the main lift. So with that being said, and I played with it a lot. Now, here's the crazy thing. 5 years into the warm-ups, I'm doing 4 sets of 25 with 110-pound dumbbells. But it only raised my bench to 611. So there was a limiting factor to that. I think I was just at my genetic potential. But the point being is, like, my bench went from 600 to 606 with 30s, and then it went from 606 to 611 with 105s.
Wow.
So
Wow.
big difference. But I was getting used to the training. I was able to push through it. Now, what I noticed is that as my conditioning got better, no amount of powerlifting as far as squat, bench, deadlift in a day would fatigue me. So I found that if I probably would have found those warm-ups and played with them 10 years prior when I was still in my 20s, probably would have seen much larger numbers, but you live and you learn. The hard part is that you don't see the next generation taking that knowledge and pushing it to the next level, So it's difficult.
Yeah, yesterday I had one of my friends, he's like my only in-person client, that I took him, he hadn't come for a couple of months, and he said he felt detrained, so can we just like lower the max amount of weight we're using? So I said, okay, well, we'll do this method we haven't really done before. So I took him through the typical, press at the same angle, triceps and back exercise, and when I gave him 13-pound kettlebells dangled by a band, he's like, are you sure, like, are these even going to do anything? And by the second set, he was like, okay, I understand what what you're doing here. Because I just wanted to prevent him from not overtraining, but I knew he wouldn't be not allowed. His body technically wouldn't allow him to
Yeah.
move a weight that he's used before. And psychologically, I also didn't want him to get down on himself.
Yeah.
But by the second set, after we had ran through the circuit twice, he's like, okay, I feel like I know why we're doing this. And it didn't beat him up, although this was Wednesday and he texted me today. He's like, yeah, we're going to have to cancel tonight. I'm sore as shit. But it didn't really beat him down, but it did get him ready. Like in the workout, he performed fine. It's just that now he's sore, but he's been detrained for a while. But it's just, like you said, it's a mindset thing. They don't, just because it's coming first in your workout doesn't mean you're going balls to the wall. You have to remember that it's meant for potentiation, activation. It is a Wenning warm up. Like it says warm up. That's one of the things as well. It's not, okay, this is my first exercise. Now it's balls to the wall on that. So it's just a mindset shift that needs to happen.
You know, they don't understand that light weights. And it's funny because when you read Vorbiev and a couple of other large researchers from the Soviet Union, they were on to the same path. I remember Vasily Alexiev, one of the all-time great Olympic lifters, would swing a 50-pound kettlebell for 15 minutes straight before he touched a barbell. Now, how does that? Think about being able to do figure eights and snatches and one-arm cleans and just stay moving. Just stay moving with a 50-pound kettlebell for 15 minutes and tell me how wrecked even a decent athlete would be. And you're like, this dude was 370 pounds doing that for conditioning before he touched a barbell. That was another big light bulb moment in my winning warm-up mentality was, well, if these guys are doing that to break 70 world records in Olympic lifting, what the hell am I doing? Right? I'm just going to hop in and go to the main lift. Yeah, that's great if you're not really trying to build a full spectrum athlete that can take the strength to the next level, because you can only do what you can recover from. And most people don't understand that recovery is built through building work capacity, right?
Yeah, I bet you ask 100 people that just are maybe younger and lift weights, they don't even know what the word work capacity is. But it's very important just across everything. I like to say you can have the most powerful engine in the world, but if it's not efficient and you don't have the right amount of gas in it for the trip you're taking, you're screwed. You're not going to get to your destination, i.e. bigger lifts, right?
Yeah, and drain your car, and I think this is a good analogy. Drain your car down to zero gas, running out of gas all the time, and find out what happens to your fuel pump. The fuel pump's cooled by the fuel. So if you run it below a quarter of a tank all the time, you're actually burning up your fuel pump. And that's a great indicator for making sure that you're training optimal, is that you're saving some in the tank so that the body has restorative methods for the next workout, right? That's where you see people screw up so bad, is they're not looking at the exercising as a cumulative effect. They're looking at it as, what can I put in today? And that's not how it works. Right? Think about it like in a savings account. I put $1,000 one day a month into my savings account, or I put $75 in it every day. How much more money is that? See? And that's how we should be looking at our training. 30-day blocks or 3 to 4 week waves with optimal intensity, volume, and duration to allow the body to actually progress further than trying to dump it all in one workout and smash ourselves to pieces. I worked out, my last workout was Wednesday, and I'll do a heavy leg day tomorrow, but my recovery is fine. If that Wednesday workout, if I had to do Thursday, I could do it all over again. I wouldn't be calling you, being like, oh, I can't come in because I'm sore or I'm beat up. Maybe not want to do it, and I'm not saying it's right to do it, but it's doable.
Yeah, one thing, I feel like one of the biggest takeaways I had, I can't remember, you were in a video with someone else, but you said most of your workouts, not all, but most, should be gun to your head. If you had to do that exact same workout tomorrow, you should be able to. That's how you know you haven't overstretched yourself.
I think that's a good rule of thumb. I mean, obviously there's more scientific ways to do it, but I think that, to explain it to millions of people, that's exactly what I would say. You're fatigued, you're tired, and you might be a little tight or sore, but you could do it if you had to, especially with the warm-up in place, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to break all that shit loose, and then you're going to be able to train, which I think the warm-up really saved my career in my early mid-30s when I was still capable of breaking world records, was the fact that I just had so much work capacity that I could recover from those hard workouts, right?
And speaking of lighter weights, there's something, I think you were the first person that I came across that said this, was when it came to the dynamic effort method, you actually, as you got stronger, lowered the percentage of straight weight you were using.
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
Well, I was comparing what the reaction to the speed work was with maximal effort day. So when I kept the percentages up around 50, 55, 60, what Louie talked about, I realized within about 6 months that that was not conducive for raw pressing power, i.e. I wasn't using a bench shirt. So if you look at Louie's definition of dynamic work, his mentality on that, in my opinion, being around him for 10 years, was based on equipped bench pressing where the coiled stretch reflex of the equipment was assisting and helping in the lift. Whereas in raw pressing, you're focusing on your tendons, ligaments, and active tissue and passive tissue to do the movement. So what I found is when I lowered the percentages back down, it actually restored me and enhanced my maximal effort day. Now, if I was an athlete, non-powerlifter, the spectrum or variety of those percentage loads would probably be a little bit different because I wouldn't necessarily utilize in the classic system a maximal effort 1 RM day for, say, a baseball player. Not all the time. I'm saying it wouldn't be used occasionally. But in a powerlifter's mindset, really the only thing when it comes down to brass tacks that matters is how it makes me get better on maximal effort day. Because my ability to display how strong I can be or how much weight is on the bar is done on my maximal effort day. So if my dynamic effort method is not making my maximal effort method better, then why wouldn't you modify it?
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so I found if I lowered the percentage down, it allowed recuperation, but it also enhanced my maximal effort day in a raw environment.
Okay, so it's when you transition over to mainly raw lifting is when you realize the percentages had to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I found that the meters per
See, I
second.
think that's also another.
If you look at equipped lifting, it's more slower and methodical. It's not quick, explosive. Raw strength is more about how quickly you can explode. And so I found that moving the speed work more closer to 1 meter per second versus what Louie talked about, which was 0.7 meters per second, tended to enhance my maximal capacity in no gear much better than a heavier load slower.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So I think I actually, it's funny. I think you just put out a video of this. What are some underrated accessory movements, whether upper body, lower body, core, that you think maybe just anyone should do, regardless of what their goals are, powerlifting, just something to strengthen their upper body, lower body, just in general?
Well, I think one is going to be just your traditional face pull, pulling weights to the forehead, building the upper back. Because the problem for a lot of us, like what we're doing right now, is sitting down, and this is 85% of the workforce. So developing a strong upper back helps with posture, and that posture muscle is going to help with our skeletal aging. And it's also going to help with neck and shoulder injuries from poor mechanics per se. So the face pull is definitely one. Another one is going to be, and again, it's getting a lot of heat because I know Dr. Mike Israetel, which is a friend of mine, has kind of busted balls on him, but I think that planks are one of the most amazing exercises to do for core bracing. Because the problem is that for most people that want to lift things off the floor, they want to do strongman, they want to do powerlifting, they may want to do CrossFit, is their bracing capacity in their abdominal region is subpar, which is causing the middle, lumbar, thoracic, and sacral spinal issues because they're not locking that in and they don't understand how to control those muscles. So I would say the plank would be another one that's a solid pick. And then your normal either Nordic curl or glute ham raise. Most people do not have the hamstring to quadricep ratio strength balance for their knees or their back to be healthy long term. And so what you find is that most people are 70% stronger with their quadriceps than they are their hamstrings, and it needs to be closer or as close to 50-50 or 1-to-1 ratio as you possibly can get, which is a constant workload and is not necessarily always possible, but it should be tried to be achieved.
Okay, and speaking of face pull and posture, I can't remember who put it up, but someone was saying that because I learned this from you, that do more pulling, much more pulling than you are pressing. They think that methodology is a bit overrated and you should actually be doing not
Yeah.
doing tons of back work, but or doing next to no back work, but you should in fact be doing more pressing to make your pressing go up. What would you say to someone who's kind of like refuting what you're saying in terms of the posture and back?
Well, if you're talking about pressing in general, there might be some validity to that statement. But if you look at guys like myself, John Russin, which is, a doctor of physical therapy, you look
Yep,
at
I know
guys
him.
like Stu McGill is another one that I can think of. You look at guys like Joe DeFranco. We're all pretty much within reason in the same ballpark of 2 times back to front ratio. Because here's the thing. We hinted, or you hinted on pressing, right? Pressing strength. But think about normal daily activity and the load that it puts on the skeletal system for anterior rotation. That's why the 2-to-1 back ratio is important. It's not because of necessarily of what you're doing in the gym. The 85-year-old grandfather that's walking around the grocery store isn't rounded forward and looking down because he bench pressed all the time. Gravity did that to him. And so what are you doing to counteract normal gravity pressure? So by doing more anterior pressing work, you're enhancing gravitational load forward. So not only are you trying to counterbalance the pressing work, which is what everybody thinks you're doing, you're actually countering normal gravitational aging. That's why that 2-to-1 ratio is so important.
Okay. And even like I understand what you're saying. No matter what we're doing, no matter what our job is, most likely we're going to be doing something, whether we're a mechanic, we work at a desk, etc. We're most likely going to be moving our arms in front of us.
Yeah.
So then we have a lot of anterior movement throughout the day. So, okay. So that's not necessarily, well, it will, but that's not necessarily just to get better lifts. It's just for balance and posture.
Absolutely. And the person that has better posture, better muscle balance is going to be long-term the person that can press the most, the longest. And so I think we need to start looking at the context of these people and understanding, are they talking to a powerlifter that doesn't care that their posture is wrecked at 50 years old? Or are they talking to the general population that really needs higher level postural awareness? And the problem is that most of the shit that's fed down their throats is from Muscle and Fitness and Flex Magazine and all these garbage influencers that say things like that, which are, well, you don't need 2-to-1 back ratio because that's not going to help your pecs get bigger. Well,
yeah.
okay, but if it keeps me from having shoulder surgeries when I'm 50 or neck problems, that sounds like a little bit more of a achievable and wanted goal for the average person. And that's where we have to think of this stuff in context, because people that have biomechanical backgrounds like me, most of them are not going to refute doing a 2-to-1 back ratio. You find that makes about that have degrees or lack thereof of areas that they don't understand skeletal wear and mileage. They're only thinking muscle.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes when people think of 2-to-1 back ratio, they're thinking of exercises like heavy dumbbell rows or heavy barbell rows. Their mind automatically goes to heavy. But I feel like sometimes if you're just getting a lot of blood into your back and pumping it up with things like light chest supported rows, rear delt raises, lat pull downs, I see you're a fan of, face pulls, like you said, those are things that it's not a high energy cost. It's not a high CNS cost.
My personal opinion is your
the return on investment is huge.
Yeah. My personal opinion is the back muscles in which we need to really focus on tend to want to, for most people, be more activated with higher volumes with perfect form versus heavy. Because I can tell you about 80% online of the bent over rows that I see with heavy dumbbells, they're not even using the right muscles. So they'd be better off going half that and focusing on a 2-2 or 3-3 tempo, which myself and Dr. Israetel truly actually have some agreements on, which is most people, when they lift, if they truly want the benefit out of it, need to slow down a little bit and focus on the mind-muscle connection versus just trying to lift more weight.
Yeah, for sure. I think that could hold true for a lot of things, not just back. So those are all the major questions. And I'm just going to ask you like the 20 rapid fire questions. I think there's 20. And you just, whatever first comes to your mind, that's what you hit me with.
All right.
So favorite lift with a dumbbell?
That's a tough one. Let's say Cuban press.
Okay. Home gym, garage gym, or basement gym?
Well,
sorry, commercial gym, home gym or garage gym?
Depending on budget, I think the garage gym might be your best bet for most people because most people's garages tend to be bigger than their basements. Mine's pretty equal. I would garage or basement, depending if you have training partners to come and help. But I would completely stay away from the big box gyms, commercial gyms, because more people in there are doing dumber shit than you could possibly imagine. And you're going to get poorer information and probably visual acuity than you are if you just did it on your own and actually focused on the right people.
I agree with that. Chalk, hook grip, or straps?
Oh, straps, absolutely not. Hook grip, I would say no, because it's not really usable in the general environment. Like you're not going to hook grip 80%, 90% of the things you pick up. So for me, using chalk and building a very strong grip without a hook is not only transferable to the real world, but also, in my opinion, is protective of the shoulder and a lot of other connective tissues because you're not able to hold something that the rest of the tissues can't handle.
That makes sense. Speaking of grip, have you ever used an apparatus? It's called a Gripito.
No, but I think I know what you're talking about.
It's pretty cool. That's like most of my grip training. I see you have the thing where you put the plates on and it's like you squeeze it together with your hands. I've never used one of those, but they look pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
In your opinion, now you might step on some toes here, but in your opinion, the best strength coach ever, not just one you've worked with.
No, there's so many good ones for different reasons. It's difficult, but if I had to say, it would probably be A.S. Mevdiev, and the reason for that is not only was he an Olympic champion in his own right in the 50s, he also got his PhD and then trained the Dynamo Club for the Soviet Union, creating well over 100 masters of sports. So not only was he an applied person, he was a scientific person that was, in my opinion, the father of scientific conjugate. So you can't really go. A.S. Mevdiev's writings are so underutilized, I think, as a coach and a lifter.
The most hated exercise for yourself. Maybe you hate doing it, you hate seeing it, answer it in your own way.
Honestly, with a conjugate mindset, I don't have exercises I hate. I have ones that I don't like. Like I would probably say stiff-legged sumo deadlifts, but it's why I put them in my program so much is because I feel that it hits muscle groups that most people ignore a lot, especially with good technique. But I wouldn't say that I hate it. I'd just say that it's highly effective, but highly taxing.
Okay. Your favorite upper body accessory exercise?
Probably a variation of the JM press or triceps.
Barbells or dumbbells in general?
Well, again, it depends on how many exercises you know, but I'd say dumbbells if I had to choose one.
Sleds or weighted carries?
I'm a bigger fan of sleds because of their traction understanding. So in my opinion, weighted carries are more compressive. So dragging sleds tend to be similar muscle recruitment without the compression forces, which would increase mileage.
Raw or geared lifting?
Well, I'm one of the few, maybe the only lifters to break world records in both. And they're very different in their approach to things. But the geared lifting, I think, allowed average people to be world record holders if they were patient enough and could be technically proficient enough. So I like geared lifting for that reason, but I like raw lifting because there's nowhere to really hide. But then you're also at the mercy of what your genetics are at certain points. So I would say if I had to choose, probably raw lifting, but equipped lifting has its own place as well.
Okay. Your top recovery tool?
Well, anybody will tell you is sleep, but getting the quality of your sleep is what's crucial. That's why, in my opinion, magnesium supplementation from places like ATP Labs, which has Center Mag and Yin Reserve, are crucial for training progression just so you can heal. But sleep's a big one, but I also use hot tubs tremendously. I'm a more fan of heat than I am cold. I know cold immersions has gotten a lot of publicity in recent years, but I didn't use cold immersions very much to break world records. And I find it interesting that people use it to bench press 200. So to me, when I see people talking to me about cold shit, I'm automatically realize they're weak as hell. You know what I mean? And that's just kind of what I see. It's kind of like, anything that, in my opinion, anything that gets super popular usually has a backlash in the high level community because you're just like, people try to look for things that are simple. But in my opinion, if you can get really good sleep and you can get heat displaced either in sauna, hot tub, steam room, those are going to be your biggest go-tos on that.
Yeah, I do say that the cold plunge has like it's not magic and people are treating it like it's magic. I
Yeah.
have one in my backyard. It was pretty cold this winter in Canada, so it froze. It was like completely froze solid. I couldn't use it for like 2 months, but my main thing that I use it for is when I come home from jujitsu in the evening, I find if I go in there for 5 minutes, it spikes my adrenaline up a little bit, but then I slowly get more and more tired. So I find it makes me fall asleep quicker, but
Yeah.
not that I think it's going to put me over the
Yeah.
edge and have this magic effect on my body.
Yeah, I think the reduction of inflammation at the joints definitely has its place with cold plunging, but in reality, most of our inflammation is occurring due to poor nutritional habits. So if I had to choose somebody that
I'd agree with that for sure.
ate really well and slept really well, I'd much rather have that person that tries to use all these modalities to fix a bunch of shit, right?
Yeah, I feel like you have to look at the low hanging fruit first before you start looking at all these other
Yeah.
external things.
Yeah, I mean, what's funny with that question is I had a professional, I won't say where because it might pick him out, but he's like, I did his bioprint and he was like 31% body fat. So this dude was sloppy. And he's asking me about cold plunging. And I'm like, why don't you just fix your fucking diet?
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
for
It's like, come
sure.
on,
For
dude.
sure. When it comes to music, while lifting, metal or hip hop?
I'm right in the middle. Honestly, if I had to choose, probably hip hop because, Chuck Vogelpohl and myself and that what I would consider the Dynamo Club of Westside Barbell, we had the weakest lifter in that group was 1,015 squat out of 10 people.
Ooh.
That was the weakest.
Yeah.
And Chuck was all about the DMX and the Tupac. But I'm a huge fan of the old school rock too, the AC/DC, Metallica. To me, though, like hard, slower beats and understanding what they're saying. And if you watch my videos, you'll see it. Like, to me, that gets me more hyped up than stuff that's like metal thrash. I don't get into that. To me, I don't need the anxiety pump. I need to be very focused when I train.
That makes sense. When it comes to Chuck, is he, because when I first started getting into this, I missed that whole era, let's say.
Yeah.
Is he, like, because you obviously trained with him, is he like the legend that people make him out to be? Like, because you trained with him.
Yeah, he definitely is. He's one of those guys that makes you earn his friendship. He trained with you. He saw something in you, but he also was very impatient with making sure that you knew what was going on, what your jobs were, if you were supposed to be loading. Chuck would be one of those guys you would train with, and you might get one cue, like push your feet out harder or get your chest up. And if he saw the next time you guys trained that you fixed that point, he would fix another point and another point and another point. And he coached through one step at a time slowly. So by year 2 of training with Chuck, my squat was very similar to Chuck's because I was listening to everything he was telling me. But because I listened, he was more of an open book for me. But I watched him treat people poorly when he did not get listened to or respected the way he thought he would do. And the way he dealt with that was more harsh than the average person probably could handle. I mean, Louie was the same way. But yeah, Chuck, there was no training partner that had the intensity that Chuck had. I mean, my training partner now, Big Rob, when we were hitting big numbers, was pretty close and much more kind than Chuck was. But Chuck just had this aura around him that you just did not want to disappoint him. Like, I don't know how to describe it, but those were some of my best years of training and some of my most memorable years of competing. But it wasn't without scars. Like, I remember it was just a harsh environment. And I liked it that way, but the average person doesn't take that kind of coaching anymore.
That makes sense.
I probably had Chuck tell me good job maybe 3 times in 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah. But he was.
And that could send some people the other way too.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Because most people do that.
Yeah.
They lift heavy weights or because of ego. And I'm not saying that I didn't have or have an ego, but it was more directed differently with someone that you have a mentorship under. Like Chuck, you wanted to please Chuck. You wanted to make him feel like his time was valuable because in that time, Chuck never charged me to train with him. I never gave him money. But he expected you to be there as like a loyal training partner that was like a best friend at that time. And that's what it was. You didn't miss workouts. It didn't matter if it was fucking Christmas, man. Like you trained. And that's the way it was. If Christmas fell on a squat day, you're squatting before you go home for Christmas. It was that way. And that's some ways a negative for me now because I sense that when I have a client tell me, well, I got this going on, I can't come in. And I'm thinking in my head, like sometimes what would Louie say? What would Chuck say? And I realized I'm not in that world anymore. So it's hard for me to deal with that sometimes. And sometimes it's got me in trouble too.
Yeah. Would you rather train tactical or athletes or like field athletes?
Well, I think it depends. It depends on the interest of the client or the person. I think when I trained Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning, those guys were really good to me and they listened and they were yes, sir, no, sir. And they were absorbing what I was telling them. Fast forward into more of infantry, which is more general army. There were a handful of guys that were like that too, but there were a lot of guys that just were there because they wanted to run away from home or they didn't have the right family structure or whatever they may be. But my point being is it just kind of depends on, I've trained field athletes that I felt were more amazing than tactical athletes and vice versa. It just kind of depends. It's more individual. I just like to train people that really want to give their all out effort. You know, for me, that's the icing on the cake. I wouldn't say that anyone's better, but you know, tactical would be probably a little bit more up my alley just because I've been around more elite people tactical wise. Not that I haven't trained some pro athletes, but you know, when you're training Ranger Regiment guys and Delta guys, it's definitely a different mindset.
Okay. Steak or chicken?
Steak by far. But my blood work says chicken.
Sushi or tacos?
Tacos. I hate sushi.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that as well. If you could describe your training style for yourself, for your clients in one simple sentence.
Weakness focused, high variety, low mileage, and multiple contraction types.
Okay. And what I do with the people that have appeared, I just give them maybe 2 to 3 minutes at the end. It's either you can shout out your businesses, let's say, or just, well, normally that's a given. And then they say something that just like a message, whether it's your mantra, your mission statement, whatever, just something you think 2 to 3 minutes that will help someone listening, maybe just change their mindset on something, brighten up their day, keep them pushing forward, something like that.
Yeah. My mantra on training has always been try to read at least as much or more than you lift. So if you're lifting 4 days a week for an hour, try to read 6 or 8 hours a week if possible. There's so much information that is out there. And what I mean by reading is picking up a book, not getting on the internet. That's a huge factor. And I think it creates a lifestyle that is conducive for overall growth. You know, not all the books that I read are directly for lifting or powerlifting. Some of them's mental motivation. Some of them are things of that nature that are a big help. We, meaning myself, Wade Russell, and John Branham, that are on the online coaching on winningstrength.com, we live and breathe what we do. And combined, we have over 100 years of experience. So with online coaching, you're not going to find a better staff that is able to really cater to your needs as far as that's concerned. All of the manuals that we've made on winningstrength.com are manuals in which we have utilized with multiple people to create maximal success. The Over 40 manual was designed for Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Child Youth Development Manual is a kid that just signed with USC for football. And he came to me at 5 years old.
Oh.
You know, a lot of these things are tried and true. The Special Ops Manual was a manual I designed for an elite special forces group. The point being is that we don't write anything until we apply it. And that's kind of what we do at winningstrength.com. For a more affordable selection, we have Patreon, which you have instant access to me to answer questions. So if you get on Patreon, go to Winning Strength and get to the top tier on that. And if you just want more workouts without having to think about what you're doing in a smart and educated fashion with video tutorials on how to do each exercise, we have a conjugate and a tactical train heroic app, which allows you to be able to follow those workouts and answer some questions within reason, more for people that just want to get to work and they just want to have something they can follow that's easy to understand and can track. So that's what we do.
Cool. Well, thank you once again, Matt, for agreeing to appear.
Yeah.
I'll put all of your Instagram, your website, all that into the description. If people are interested, they can join your Patreon. They can check out your Train Heroic app, all that stuff. Once again, thank you for being on. To everyone else, check out Matt on Instagram. That's where I follow him. Check out all the links in the description. If you like this style of video, please give me a like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, class is dismissed.